In 2010 and 2011, China alone consumed 64% of the world's cement, 58% of the world's iron ore, about 45% of the coal, steel, and lead, and since it's lunchtime, 44% of the world's pigs, 40% of the eggs, and about 27% of the soybeans. Now, just pause for a minute and consider those numbers. They're absolutely huge. Now, some of those numbers will be adjusted as China is built, but India and others will follow not long thereafter. Sub-Saharan Africa grew at 5 to 6% a year for the decade before the financial crisis and has already more than recovered its position and is growing roughly at that rate now, recognizing there's huge diversity in Sub-Saharan Africa. Over the past 5 years, 2/3 of global growth came from developing economies. And as recently as the 90s, that would have been about a quarter or a fifth. Over the past 10 years, exports from developed countries to developing countries rose from 25 to 45% of their total exports. In the case of the U.S., it actually rose from 25 to 50%. In the 1990s, about 70% of the world's reserves were held in developed economies. Now it's about 70% in developing economies. Now, what I'm describing is a general shift. It's not a forecast by any means. Countries vary enormously. Developing countries were obviously also hit by the downturn, and many of them need significant structural reforms, just as the developed economies do. But my broader point is that I became a U.S. Trade Representative in 2001. I then was Deputy Secretary of State in 2005 and 6, briefly at Goldman Sachs, then President of the World Bank. So for 11 years, from 2001 to 2012, I saw this change. And if you like history, as I do, 11 years is a blink of an eye in historical terms. But the rapidity of these changes is indeed earth-shaking. So the nature of the world economy is changing, and it's changing very quickly. This will have implications, of course, for trade, but also investment, remittances, tourism, development strategies, logistics and supply chains, South-South and South-North investment and business flows, the environment, and since we've got James Mann here, I will also argue security, too, over time. Now, when you think about this from whatever policy interests you have, it's important to drill down further and start to get a sense of some of the implications. So let me just give you a few to give you some examples. Urbanization. China is 50% urbanized today. The forecast is by 2030 it will be 70%. South Asia will go from about 30% to 55%. A lot of people don't recognize Sub-Saharan Africa is already a very urbanized continent. This has very big changes not only for building things, but lifestyles, education, infrastructure, environmental issues. Many of the cities in East Asia are in low-lying areas, so there's issues that are related to climate change. The rise of a new middle class. There are about 2 billion people who have incomes between $3,000 and $20,000 a year, and they provide about $12 trillion of purchasing power. Agriculture. Most of the world's agricultural policies are still built on the assumption from the mid-20th century where you had increasing surpluses and decline in staples prices. I believe because of reasons of population growth, urbanization, changes in income and diet, that we're shifting to a very different posture where you're going to have a gradual increase of demand, but because stocks are relatively low in historical terms, you're going to have a lot of volatility around that demand. So one of my friends, J.B. Penn, who was Undersecretary of Agriculture, is now the chief economist at John Deere, pointed out to me that I'm from the Midwest, so I think of corn, agricultural prices, that the price of a bushel of corn could be between $4 and $20 a bushel within 45 days, depending on forecasts of weather. These are huge shifts, and as I mentioned, in the case of agricultural policies, the U.S. agricultural policies are built for a different century and decade. Changes in business models. So one of the things the World Bank did has a private sector arm, IFC, heavily involved with different types of private sector investments. And the gentleman who ran that, a Swedish person named Lars Tunnell, once came back to me and we were talking about the telecom market and emerging markets. Now, for any of you who know how U.S. business models work, in the telecom industry in the U.S. or Europe, the idea is basically you get a customer and then you try to build the revenue with added services. But in the case of India, and particularly given the costs of technology, it's a question of if you get a lot of customers and a lot of basic services, you get a lot of minutes and you got a lot of revenues. It's a fundamentally different approach. Healthcare. About 90% of the healthcare in India is done through hospital-based. And in areas like cataracts and heart surgery, it's really of comparable quality to what you would find in the United States, but it's a lot lower cost because they don't have some of the litigation. They run the machinery basically 24 hours a day. So these are shifts, and including with some of these different consumer markets, you're going to get different patterns. Now, of course, there's no straight line. There's no sort of all positive. These countries face huge challenges too, and let me just kind of post one. And this is one that was first started to get more attention because of a project we did at the World Bank with China called the China 2030 report. And it was driven by the Chinese concern about the so-called middle income trap. This is the challenge that countries face when they, after a certain level of growth and development, the productivity starts to slow and income start to slow. And just as an exemplar of that, the World Bank went and looked at the economies over the course of some 50 years, using 1960 as a base. And in 1960, the World Bank had identified 101 economies as middle income. By 2008, so almost 50 years later, only 13 had made it to high income, and one was Greece. So you can figure out whether it's 12 or 13. This is going to have implications for infrastructure, service sector development, education, and human capital, some great opportunities. But the last point kind of I'll make about this is that if you think about the international system that many of the people in this room kind of grew up with, either from a business or a policy or academic point of view, it was fundamentally a trilateral system. The United States was the leader of it. Over time, the European Union and Japan, with the G7, created a lot of the structures for economics or security or politics. Well, today you have a European Union preoccupied with its own challenges, struggling to keep the Eurozone alive. Japan is dealing with demographics, natural disaster, deflation. The U.S. is the one of the three that has a chance to get its act together and lead the system. But the international order that came out of the post-World War II period with various variations for 65 years, that is in fundamental flux. And so one of the challenges will be whether these emerging market countries will also feel their interest in this order and how it might change. But, and this will be the closing point I'll make, is that it's important to keep in mind that even the so-called middle-income countries are home to about 70 to 80% of the people living under $2 a day. So one of the challenges, if you're dealing with environment or you're dealing with trade or other topics, is the countries that loom large in the American mind as sort of rising powers or economic competitors. In those countries' capitals, they're saying, look, we still have a lot of poor people. We still have a lot of challenges to be able to cope with, so we can't take on some of the full set of responsibilities that you're expecting us to do. And what I've just observed through the serendipity of life, whether it be trade or environment or investment or even other areas, is that tension is, I think, going to be one of the defining issues for the decades to come.